Hi everybody, welcome back, and welcome to part 2 of my series about my pet line against the Slav defense, which begins with the moves d4, d5, c4, c6, cd5, takes, and bishop g5. In my first video, I gave a general overview of this opening. I talked about the most popular lines. I also gave what I believe to be the best lines for black, and showed some ideas for white to play against them. And the response I got was really great. A lot of my friends watched the video. There were some people who were interested in playing the opening. They tried it out in online games. They had some good results. They got some of the positions that I showed. And then there were also some people who had specific questions about what to do in some lines that I did not cover in the first video. In particular, there were two specific lines that came up that I want to talk about today. And I gave some answers at the time, but I want to go deeper in this video. So I'm not just going to focus on the opening here. You know, it would be very easy for me to make a short segment covering each of these things and giving some simple recommendation and then moving on, but I don't want to do that. I want to use this video to demonstrate how to think, how to make a plan when we play an opening like the bishop g5 exchange Slav. At some points, we're even going to exit the opening and go into the middle game or even the end game. And my goal is for this to be pretty instructive about positional chess, even if you don't have any interest in this opening whatsoever. So that's what I want to do in this video. Then my intention is to make a part 3 where, unlike the more strategic waters of this video, I want to take a look at some crazy, sharper lines that can happen in this opening. And then I will wrap up the series with a fourth and final video where I show my favorite game that I ever played in this opening in over the board tournament chess. So that's my current plan. And once it's all said and done, which won't take very long, I intend to post these next few in kind of rapid succession, then there should be a 4-part video playlist about the bishop g5 exchange Slav that anyone can use as a reference point for an easy, positional, less theoretical way to play against the Slav defense. Now, the two responses that I wanted to look at in this video that I got asked about since the previous one are what to do if black plays g6 and bishop g7, and also about what if black plays knight d7 followed by knight gf6. So those two systems are going to be the focus of this video. So the first topic that I wanted to talk about today is what happens if black plays a setup with g6. They could do it in this position, or they could do it after knight c6, knight c3, and g6. So this came up in some of the viewer games. The games that my friends played in this opening. The g6 happened. They're going, what do I do against g6? It wasn't mentioned in the original video. So let's figure it out. Let's talk about what we can do about g6. First of all, we should understand why is black playing g6. I mean, g6 is a thing sometimes in the Slav defense. There's even a setup with a name for it, the Schlechter Slav, where black plays g6, bishop g7 within the Slav defense. But here I think g6 has a particular aim, which is they want to avoid having to deal with the damaged pawn structure after knight f6 and bishop takes. They want to play bishop g7, and then they want to play knight f6, such that now we're not going to take on f6 because they could just recapture with the bishop. Okay, this makes some sense. So we have to take it seriously. And let's look at some possible ways that we could play against this. So first of all, what happens if we just develop our pieces? Because I think we can. I think that there are a bunch of ways that you can play against g6. And the computer was saying maybe white can just sort of develop their pieces simply, like e3, bishop g7, knight f3, knight f6, bishop d3, and castles. Something like this. And now, you could castle here, but maybe you wanted to prevent the opponent from playing bishop g4, because if you play h3 here, it's very difficult for this bishop to find activity. So let's maybe throw that move in, see what happens. And now black has some choices. I took a look at this position in the Lichess database, and a lot of players with black were playing bishop f5. And this led to an interesting pawn sacrifice for black, because white can take on f5, take on f6, and play queen b3, and there are 2 pawns hanging, and black can't defend both of them. So then black was sacrificing this one, and black was playing e6, and on queen b7, there are a couple moves that you need to be a little bit concerned about. Queen d6 with the intention to bring a rook to b8, I guess, is one of them. Knight a5 was happening in some of the games. That's also possible. And the computer said, I'm not afraid of this, you know. Seems like objectively white should just be up a pawn. But it's not as simple as that. There were some games where black won here. So this is something that I think maybe deserves further analysis. Probably it's pretty good for white, but you got to make sure that your queen is able to get back and that you get to finish your development in castle. So that's one thing that we can put aside. Also, black, of course, doesn't have to play something like bishop f5. Another thing that often happened in the Lead Chess database was something like a6. And maybe castles, b5. White goes to rook c1. White has the idea to play knight b5 followed by rook c6, but black was playing bishop b7. And then you have a bunch of choices how to develop. You can play queen e2. You could put this bishop back on this diagonal. I think that's kind of an attractive choice. And if I had to take one side, I would prefer white, because I do think that white's pieces are generally a bit better than black's. It's going to be difficult for black to achieve any pawn breaks here. The e5 break would just be very weakening to this pawn. And white does have some good dark square control. So it makes sense that the computer would be kind of a fan of this way to play. But it's also not very direct, not very forcing. So let's give another idea of something else that white can do to put more pressure on black's position after they've played the move g6. So back in this position, something that I always used to have as my preparation against the g6 setups for black was to try to hit black with an early Qb3 move. I always felt like that was the best way to put pressure on the opponent whenever they went for these g6, bishop g7 setups, because sometimes the pawn on d5 could be a bit weak. Think about it this way. After e3, bishop g7, and queen b3, black can't play e6. They certainly can't do it now because their pawn is pinned to their queen. But even if they were to do it later, that would weaken a lot of dark squares because they've already played g6 and bishop g7, and that could create weaknesses that we could later exploit. Also, black has a problem, which is that they probably can't play knight f6 because we can take it and then we can try to take on d5. So their options to save this pawn are limited, and maybe this position's a bit awkward for black. That is something that I've looked more deeply into as I've been preparing for this video, and I've discovered a few things and come to some conclusions. I definitely think this is also a decent try for white, and let's go through the options. First of all, when this position happened in the online games, black was very often playing knight f6. I don't know if it's because black noticed that white could play bishop f6 and take on d5 or not, or if black was legitimately gambiting a pawn. But it struck me that white wasn't scoring nearly as well as I would have thought after bishop takes f6, bishop takes, and queen takes d5. Because white should be up a pawn here. But I looked into some of the games, and I figured out what was happening. A lot of the games continued something along the following lines. Black was castling, white was playing queen takes d8, rook takes d8. Then white would develop like knight f3, and black would try to open the center with e5, because black is down a pawn, but they want to get counterplay, they want to open the lines for their pieces, and they're ahead in development. Now, a lot of the players with white didn't want to open all the lines for the black pieces with d takes e5, so they were playing d5, keeping the position closed, then knight b4, and something like castles along e4, and the position became quite messy. Objectively, I still think that white's doing pretty well here, but now you start to see some of the activity for black's pieces and some of the complications that may arise. And I guess that's one of the reasons why people weren't doing as well, even though they're winning the pawn in the opening. So then I went back a little bit and I tried to figure out what went wrong there. Does black have compensation? And the answer is no, but it requires an understanding of the opponent's ideas. All the time in chess, we should have a running track of what our ideas are and what the opponent's ideas are. What do we want to do if we're given time in a position, and what is the opponent trying to do? Right here, black is ahead in development and down a pawn. They want to strike while they can, and it's very clear to me that black wants to play e5. So, surprisingly, this natural move knight f3 might be a little bit inaccurate because it seems to allow black to get some of the counterplay they want. And the computer was screaming for white to play f4 in this position, and it claims that white has a huge advantage and is up by a full pawn and should be doing very well. f4 prevents black's idea e5, and if black doesn't play e5, they have no ways to open the position. So even though this is not a developing move and it takes time, and white may fall even further behind in development after this, there's no good way for black to take advantage of that. So then, in the next few moves, white can play knight f3. Maybe white can bring this rook to c1. They can move this bishop out. They could castle or maybe even king f2. And even though they don't have the two bishops, the pawns do a great job of controlling the dark squares, and we have this nice bishop on the light squares. Unfortunately, most of the players in this position who had white didn't come up with this move. Makes sense. Especially in a quick time control, you figure you just got to develop your pieces and castle as quickly as you can and consolidate your extra pawn. But what ended up happening was black was getting a lot of counterplay and causing some problems for white. Also, it could be noted that maybe white doesn't even have to take this queen here. White could easily just play something like knight f3 or develop this bishop or something and try to play some other ways. But that was just something that I noticed about how white was running into some problems even when they were winning a free pawn in the opening. Okay, so even though there are some specific things to think about, it's a little bit deeper than just this. Bishop takes f6 followed by queen takes d5 does win a pawn for white, and it probably is a clean pawn. Black doesn't seem to have much in the way of compensation. So knight f6 doesn't really seem to work very well. What else can black do? Well, they can't play e6. They can't use any other pieces to defend this pawn. Bishop e6, maybe we can take on b7. So that doesn't seem to be working. So they're left with the options to try to kick this bishop away from g5, which are things that they often do against the doof attack anyway, as we know. And the main options would be for them to go h6 or f6 to kick this bishop. If black plays h6, bishop h4, g5, and bishop g3, the position goes in a direction that we should already be familiar with from me discussing it in the previous video. Here, it's going to be difficult for black to have a safe king or to have a lot of control over many important kingside squares after white goes with the h4 break later on. These pawns in h6 and g5 are a little bit overextended, so something like knight f6, bishop d3, castles, h4, g4, and then knight e2. Maybe you will go knight f4, you can play h5, and I would take white for a lot of the same reasons why I liked white in the positions that I showed you in the previous video when we looked at h6 and g5. Okay, so the only other way to try to kick this bishop would be for black to play f6. And here, I think it makes sense for white to play bishop h4. Now you're threatening to take on d5 again, so that really limits black's options. One option that they have is a very tricky, silly move, which is h5. And if you ever get this position, please remember to ask what the opponent's threat is. It's a constant thing you should be doing in chess. What's their threat? What are they trying to do? Don't make the mistake of playing queen takes d5 in this position, and then you're going to get your bishop trapped with g5, bishop g3, h4, and then suddenly you're in trouble. There's no reason why that should happen. If the opponent plays a move like h5, you should realize what they're trying to do. Make a spot for your bishop, just go h3. And now this is a weakening move on the king side. So probably not a good idea for black, but it's something I wanted to point out. Objectively, it seems like in this position, black finally needs to play e6. And if they go e6, we're not going to be able to take their pawn on d5. And so maybe white should be a little bit better here because black has kind of blocked in both of their bishops, and they're not going to have a ton of activity for their pieces. So let's continue a bit further, just to show a potential middle game situation that could come from this line. Bishop d3, knight g7, knight g2, castle. Maybe castles. Also rook c1 is possible, delaying castling in case of g5, bishop g3. Maybe you want to go h4 there, but let's just say castles. And I was analyzing these positions for a bit, and I was taking a look at some ideas. I noticed that if black played knight f5, it makes a lot of sense for white to take this. The two bishops, not a big concern in this closed sort of position, and when they take back, they'll have some type of pawn structural weakness, stuff that I covered in the previous video. Also, white can try to jump into some of these weak dark squares. That was one of the purposes of this whole thing. Now d6, c7, maybe you can play bishop g3, rook c1. Knight b5 could be an idea in some lines. You got to make sure that black doesn't achieve the e5 break. But it's very difficult for them to achieve it because very often white can attack with e4 at some point, exploiting this pin. Also, if black plays knight a5, I was looking at this move, queen a3. Now if they go knight c4, I can take it and then play queen c5 and I'm going to win this pawn. And maybe an idea would be bishop g3, bishop d6, rook c1, getting into some of these dark squares. So this seemed like some light pressure, but kind of annoying for black, and I liked it. And so this is another possible recommendation against the g6 idea. So each of the approaches that I just mentioned has certain benefits, and I would prefer white's position in all the cases that I showed you in the main lines of the queen b3 variation immediately, or just playing knight f3, bishop d3. But I also want to point out that sometimes you can combine ideas in chess. And so something else that I was looking at was knight f3 first, and then if black has played knight f6, maybe now it's time to play queen b3. One benefit of doing this is you're already threatening bishop f6 and queen d5, and they can't kick your bishop with f6 anymore. So maybe that has certain benefits over playing queen b3 right away. One thing you always have to check is to make sure that black isn't getting a ton of compensation if they just castle here. And if bishop takes, and queen takes, it's a little scary because maybe black goes e5. And if you take on d8, rook takes d8, you get the same position that I mentioned previously with black trying to open the center. Objectively should be good for white, but requires some precision. But I think that it makes a lot of sense for white to take on d5 with the knight here, threatening knight takes f6. So maybe black will prevent that with bishop g7. And now make sure you don't allow something like bishop e6 or something tricky like that. The knight can go back to c3. This happened, or at least this position was reached by transposition and slightly different move order in a game where Fabiano Caruana had white, and he won a pretty nice game. He was pretty much up a pawn for most of the game and just converted. And in the position here, black tried to open the center with e5, which is what they're going to try to do. And he kept it closed by playing d5, and he went on to win. And I will put that game in the description along with a few other instructive games that I'll mention throughout the course of this video. So that's one reason why I don't think that black can castle, and why I do think they have to address the threat of bishop f6 followed by taking on d5. Okay, another option is knight a5. But here it seems like bishop b5 is very strong for white. Black goes bishop d7 and now queen a4. White is threatening to play bishop takes f6. And if black takes back, then bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and then queen takes a5 would win a piece for white. So maybe black should bring their knight back to c6. Then white can even think about doing the bishop f6 thing and taking on d5. Be a little careful though, because this is actually a little bit embarrassing here. Knight takes d5 after e takes if black goes a6. Because if you take on c6, black takes back, making a fork. And there are some tactical issues if you move your bishop back and your queen becomes exposed on the same diagonal as this bishop on d7. So maybe you don't have to take the pawn right away. Maybe you can just play chess. And remember, we've seen this e takes f6 structure with the weak d5 pawn before, and we know that it's pretty good for white. Another option is after knight c6, the computer wanted white to play knight e5 in this position. And if black takes it, they're actually in grave danger. Let's say knight takes e5, d takes, bishop takes b5, queen takes. Now this knight's hanging, so knight d7, and then white can take this, and white's threatening to take on e7, and it's a really disastrous position for black already, I would say. All this is to say that I think after the move queen b3, black needs to play e6 here. And that's kind of what we wanted, right? We wanted black to create a lot of holes on dark squares and to lock in their bishop on c8. So to my mind, white has a better position. And we can continue with something like bishop d3, castles. Now a lot of players in this position castled here, but I even like the move h3, because this way, if black ever goes h6 and tries to get your bishop, you can play bishop f4, knight h5, you can go bishop h2, and your bishop is on this beautiful diagonal. Later you can play rook c1, you can try to jump into some of these squares, and I think it's pretty easy to understand why white should have some pull. Now, as far as actually winning the game, you're still going to have to do a lot of work, you know. The game's not going to win itself just because you got a good position from the opening. But I think that I've given you a lot of good ideas against g6, so that if you face this, you'll have some concept of what to do, and you'll know not just how to play the first few moves, but you'll know what sorts of things you want to achieve, and maybe what types of plans you want to go for. And I want to do the same sort of thing when I talk about the second option that I wanted to explore in this video, which was knight d7 followed by knight g f6. Now I want to transition to talking about the other move that I got asked about, that I did mention in the first video, which is in this position, black playing knight d7. And their intention is to bring this knight from g8 to f6, supported by the knight on d7. In a lot of ways, this is a very similar idea to what we just looked at, because black is taking time to put a piece on a place where it can defend f6, so that they don't have to worry about bishop takes f6 messing up their pawn structure. What are the downsides of this move, knight d7? Well, the first one is that this bishop on c8 is not very happy. Sometimes when I'm teaching students and something like this happens, I'll put the red circle around this bishop. This bishop is raging, he's mad. He's mad at this guy because he just blocked him. He just went to d7, now the bishop can't see. But even for its own interest, I don't think that the knight going to d7 made a lot of sense. I mean, think about it. In an opening like the exchange Slav, I think it makes a great deal of sense for knights to go to c3 and c6. The knight on c3 can put pressure on the pawn on d5, maybe can jump to b5. The knight on d7 can't really jump to much of anywhere. So just after the move knight d7, we can see that white may achieve an advantage in activity, because black's queenside minor pieces are going to be a bit silly for a while. Should I just stop and say, hey, white has a good position because white's activity is better? Maybe. But in this video, I want to go further than that. And I want to show what a middle game might look like, where we take advantage of these advantages in activity and piece placement and use them to attack other weaknesses that the opponent creates, or to create a middle game plan. And I want to just continue further and show an example of that, or maybe a couple examples of that. So the one thing about this move knight d7 is you're not going to be able to refute it. I mean, positionally it's a little bit suspicious maybe, but tactically we're not going to be able to win material or anything, so it makes sense for white to continue normal development. Knight c3, knight gf6, e3, let's say. Potential variation, not saying that these moves are forced or anything like that. Let's say black goes e6. Now I want to put this bishop on its best spot. In my opinion, that's d3. And for the sake of argument, let's say black goes bishop e7, but we'll come back to this position. And maybe we put this knight on f3, castles, and castles. All right, so now black has to figure out how they want to develop this bishop on c8. White optically should have some advantage. White has better minor pieces. White has more development. But those factors aren't going to win the game for white immediately. You need to accumulate other advantages. Black needs to develop their bishop from c8. How can they do it? They can put it on b7. Maybe they can move the knight from d7 and then put the bishop there. Those are their options. Let's take a look at them. Let's say that black plays b6 to play bishop b7. Already, they've made a little bit of a weakness that we don't have. Because now, after they've played b6, they will never be able to control these light squares, c6 and a6 on the queen side, with a pawn for the rest of the game. And that's significant. That could form the basis of a middle game plan for white, even just that little factor. This is what I'm talking about when I say that this is a very positional opening at times. And I'm going to give you an example of how we might play to exploit those weaknesses. So first of all, let's develop this rook to a beautiful spot on c1. black goes with bishop b7. Now, where should we develop the queen so that it can look at some of these queenside light squares? I like e2. And just one inaccurate move by black here is all it takes. Rook c8. White goes bishop a6, and we're already jumping into these weak squares. Might be counterintuitive. I bet that there was a time in my life where I would have not understood bishop a6 very well, because I would have thought, hey, why am I trading away my beautiful bishop for their bishop that doesn't really do much? But take a look at this play that white's going to get over here on the queen side. First of all, black needs to take. If they go rook b8, maybe bishop f4, queen c7, knight takes d5. Black needs to play bishop takes a6 here. And after queen takes a6, white's already threatening the pawn on a7. And this queen is just already entrenched in the black position. So we're gaining even more of an advantage in activity, jumping into key squares. Compare the white pieces with some of the black pieces. This knight on d7 is like almost in stalemate. And white is ready to jump with knight b5 and try to get into c7. The pawn on a7 I think is actually hanging, so black should probably defend it. If they go rook a8, knight b5, rook c7 coming. This pawn is still very weak. What is black going to do? I don't know. If they go rook c7, knight b5 again. There's also bishop f4, which leads by force to this very pleasant endgame for white. Something like this, knight b5. I was analyzing this a little bit. Takes, a6 and knight a7. And now white has won the c-file, and black is going to struggle to find moves for a while. I mean, maybe they could hold if they play perfectly, but man, this doesn't look like much fun for black at all. That's just one option. Let's say white keeps some stuff on the board. They go knight b5 here. Now black has only one move. The move is knight b8. And that kicks the queen back to a4. Rook takes c1. Rook takes. This pawn is still hanging. Just a possible line here, by the way. Say black goes a6 to save it, and we jump with knight a7. b5, queen c2. White can go with queen c7 at some point. And just take a look at this position. Look at how much better all the white pieces are than the black pieces. And how many weak squares there are for white's pieces to jump into on the queen side. White's won the c-file. Maybe this knight can go to e5. The c6 square could be a problem. This a pawn is still going to be weak someday, because maybe a white piece will arrive on c6 or try to attack this pawn sort of from the side. Black has no play. I mean, really, there's just no plan for black whatsoever. And all of this just because of a few weak squares when black played b6 and white entered with queen e2 and then played bishop a6. Back in this position when white played queen e2, it's fair to wonder if black should even have allowed the move bishop a6. And I think if there are any really strong players in the audience, which there probably are, a lot of my viewers are stronger than me. A lot of my friends are pretty good at chess. They probably noticed that black shouldn't allow that, and the best way for them to stop it would be to play a6. This move has disadvantages too, though. One is that now black can't play rook c8 because the pawn on a6 would be weak. And then the question becomes, why did black go b6? Why would black not have gone a6 and b5 right away if they're going to have to go b5 anyway if they want to go rook c8? So let's talk about that. What happens if black plays a6 back in this position instead of playing for b6 and bishop b7? If black plays a6 in this position, they won't have to worry about the light squares being as weak as they were in the last variation. But I still think that the idea of a6 and b5 could potentially cause them problems and give white targets to attack on the queen side. So you could stop b5, you could play a4 if you wanted to, but I don't see a reason to do so, and I actually would like to allow them to play b5 so that then I can go a4 and try to create play that way. And I'm going to give you an example. Let's say white goes queen e2. I like queen e2 because then when black goes b5, my rook is still on a1, so I go a4, and I don't think black wants to take on a4, because then they would be putting their isolated pawn on an open file, and a lot of white pieces would be able to attack it. Maybe they could try it. I mean, b takes a4. We could take with a rook. Maybe we take with the knight. Either way, they might have to go a5 to try to remove this pawn from the square where it was weak. And then we just go rook fc1, and it looks like we're just way ahead in mobilization on the queen side. Maybe black will go b4 instead because they want to try to keep it closed. They want to gain a tempo against our knight. And we will go knight b1. Now we have the idea to go knight bd2 and knight b3. And just to illustrate, it might not look like it's that bad for black, but I really think it's quite terrible. If black goes something like bishop b7, we can consider a5 here. And it's very difficult for black to play rook c8 because the pawn on a6 is an eternal weakness. Also, the pawn on b4 is kind of artificially isolated. White is ready to play knight bd2, knight b3, and then rook c1. This bishop may go back to f4 to control d6 and c7. Black has nothing active that they can do, ever. This knight can't do anything. This bishop can't do much of anything, and it's tied down to this pawn. They just get to sit around and watch white slowly but surely find ways to invade on the queen side. And white doesn't even have to do it quickly either, because it doesn't seem like black is close to achieving any freeing pawn breaks or anything like that. So maybe black doesn't want to allow white to play a5. Black will play a5 themselves. In that case, white will continue with their plan, knight bd2, bishop b7, let's say, knight b3, rook c8. When this knight is on b3, some black piece, in this case the queen, will be tied down to the defense of this pawn. So black can't play knight e4, for instance. Let's say rook fc1, black can't play knight e4 because white will take and then take on a5. And now there are some weak light squares on the queen side. Maybe bishop a6, queen b5 could be possible. Bishop f4. I don't know what black is supposed to do. So this is the sort of stuff I'm talking about. You can't play an opening like the doof attack, the queen's gambit in general, really any opening extremely systematically. The same exact moves are not going to get you an advantage every game. You have to pay attention to what weaknesses the opponent created. That's what I love about positional chess. Every game, your opponent's going to have to make moves that give you potential ideas and potential plans. And they will give you weak squares, weak pawns to attack, maybe tactical weaknesses to try to calculate a way to exploit. And those are the sorts of challenges that I like trying to solve. And that's what I think this position is a great example of. I think white has a huge advantage here, and it's kind of back to the drawing board for black in the position where they were trying to develop their bishop from c8. Now let's add another fun idea to the mix. Let's say that black plays knight b6. The idea would be to play bishop d7, rook c8, and finish their queenside development like that. Well, if black abandons the center like this, and plays decentralizing moves and doesn't do anything, then another thing that white may have time to do is play in the center and on the king side with something like knight e5. Bishop d7, f4. This is another idea that you can add to your repertoire in positions like this. Maybe black will go rook c8, and you could consider queen f3, queen h3, that's an idea. Or rook f3. And then you can play maybe even g4 and start a kingside attack where black doesn't have enough activity to get counterplay. This is another idea that you can think about in these passive knight d7 type lines against the doof attack. And it's nice that we have this bishop outside the pawn chain as opposed to being trapped on c1 or d2 where it wouldn't be able to do much. Going back to the position where black played knight d7 to begin with, there are tons of different approaches you can take from what I showed you. I was just giving an example. There are a lot of people who like to play that sort of stonewall attacking setup right away. For example, let's say knight c3, knight gf6, e3, e6, bishop d3, bishop e7. There are a lot of games where white just goes f4 right here and then plays knight f3. And they commit to the stonewall sort of attack immediately, which I think is a potential way to play. There was a game that I'll post in the description where Grandmaster Holden Hernandez had white, where he started with knight f3, and then after black went for an a6 setup, rook c1, b5, now he decided to play knight e5, and he developed a kingside attack. Bishop b7, he could have played f4, he played queen f3 with the idea knight takes e5, d takes, knight d7, and then he played queen h3. Black had to make a weakness with g6, and then bishop takes e7, And white created an attack on the black king. Maybe this knight could go to e2, d4, h4 happened, and it was a really nice game. So I'll make sure to link it. And it goes to show that there are some differing approaches to these sorts of positions. Also, black doesn't have to play bishop e7. They can play bishop d6. And I think after bishop d6, a move like f4 makes even more sense because it really blunts this bishop, prevents the black break e5 from ever being a thing. And now, black also can't get counterplay with knight e4 because this knight is in a pin. So each of these black moves might make one plan or another more or less feasible. But in general, I think the idea of knight d7 followed by knight gf6 is not something that you should be concerned about at all when you're playing the doof attack. If I had to give a conclusion of the sort of themes of this video, it would be to pay attention to your opponent's moves. First of all, pay attention to their moves to see if they have a threat, because you don't want to miss the opponent's idea. If they have an idea, you want to see if you care about it. Maybe it's a powerful threat that you need to deal with. But also, pay attention to the consequences of their moves. Maybe their moves are creating weaknesses that you can try to exploit. This is the foundation of sort of more strategic positional chess. You latch onto a weakness, you get an activity advantage by attacking it. Maybe you win the weakness and you win material, maybe you don't. Maybe your pieces are just better than theirs the entire game because they have to devote pieces to defending a weak pawn or preventing you from entering into a weak square or something like that. That's the sort of thing that I like to see when I play an opening like the doof attack. And that was kind of the theme of today's video. In the next video, we'll see some positions that are a lot crazier than this, and where most of these slow strategic principles don't really apply as much. But that's going to be it for today. So I'll see you guys in the next one. But I think it makes more sense for, geez, my nose itches. I'm trying to give a chess lecture, but this is, I'm going to have to restart this. I'm going to restart because I forgot to fix the study. This is all messed up. What the hell am I doing? Which begins with the moves d4, d5, c4. Damn it.